Welcome to the Restoration Activation Project video commentary series. Hi, Mary Ann here, and I'm glad you could be with me. In this commentary, I'm going to be looking into psychic abilities, so-called special abilities, as they relate to and within the framework of the self-mastery awakening ascension process. Many of you on this journey have come into this world, or since you've been in this world, awakened to various psychic and sometimes maybe not psychic abilities. But it's very important that, and I'm sure many of you will have heard of most, if not all, of these abilities that I'm going to touch on and explain a little bit more. But it's important that you really come to understand them. Whether or not you think you have awakened to any of these as of yet, because many others have, and you need to be aware of some of these other abilities in others, and more than anything as a means of being self-responsible, in the sense that you are acknowledging higher order objective truths of our reality, because these abilities are an objective truth. They are happening in our reality. And the ability, therefore, to be aware of them and therefore be able to protect yourself from those who may use them against you. So it's very important that you understand and maintain a state of awareness about them. And even if you don't feel that you have any of them yourself as of yet, you could well be, it's very likely that you will be, as you proceed on your journey. If you're making progress on this journey, chances are you're going to begin awakening to some of them that you weren't aware that you had, or those of you who already have some of these abilities that could suddenly be really ramped up as you make progress on your journey. And when that's the case, other forces and all become more interested in you, so you need to be aware of them. And to not be afraid of them, or fearful of them, or fearful of having them, or to identify yourself with them, to define yourself by them. That's just as, that impedes your progress as much as denying that these abilities exist. It's just as detrimental to your progress to identify yourself with them. In other words, you would say to yourself, I am a clairvoyant, or I am clairaudient, or whatever. And to the extent that when perhaps your ability maybe falters or sometimes goes away, at least for a period of time, you don't experience a sense of loss of self. Because again, these are abilities. They are not who you are. They are gifts and talents that we are given for a specific reason in this lifetime, in this reality. And it's up to us to determine why and how we are meant to use them. That would be in alignment with higher order purpose, soul purpose, divine will, whatever. And also to be able to acknowledge them and see them in others as part of your greater understanding of the totality of objective truth. Just because you don't have them doesn't mean that they're not worth knowing about. Because chances are, if you're a sincere seeker on this journey, they're going to start bubbling up as you make progress. So anyway, let's dive right in. Here we go. I'm going to go through a number of them. Like I said, you've probably heard of most of them, but I'll delve into them and give some examples of them as I move through this. So here we go. First of all, one of the more common ones that virtually everybody on this planet has heard of is claircognizance. That's a very common one. And what that means, clair simply means clear. That's French for clear. And cognizance is knowing. So claircognizance is clear knowing. And that's the ability to receive either psychic information that's being emitted by others, or I should say being psychically emitted as opposed to being five sensory emitted or expressed, or it's the ability to receive higher order knowledge of objective truth. And this often happens by way of intense flashes or waves of information that come through the mind-body complex. And this is something that I personally experience. And it can occur as a result of consciously seeking higher order knowledge and information, or it can just come out of the blue, just out of nowhere sometimes. Now, what I mean by consciously seeking higher order information, I'm talking about doing this by means of, energetic, communicating with your core self, unconditioned consciousness and awareness, and asking questions, seeking information. I'm not talking about information that comes to you or things sort of fall into place because you've been studying a topic or researching a topic for a long time and things suddenly, finally come into place. That's different. So claircognizance is one that most people are aware of. And it's very hard to explain to others. Sometimes, it's something, something and you just know it. Now, when it happens to me, sometimes the information is so massive that it takes a while to process it, to be able to get it out there, so to speak, even for myself, to be able to understand it. I get a sense of, okay, this is what this is about, but what am I really getting here? And sometimes it takes a while. Other times it's just immediate. You know what it means, how it fits into the knowledge that I already have, or doesn't. Sometimes that happens too. Sometimes it seems to be, it's a completely new area, and it's difficult to reconcile. And sometimes you just can't. So it's a matter of, okay, this is another level of knowledge, and perhaps it's time for me to move beyond this past understanding. There's no reconciliation to be had here. And, some information, some knowledge that I held prior gets thrown under the bus. But that's part of the process too. So I'm sure many of you are experiencing claircognizance at some level. You've experienced this. And many of you out there that think you don't have abilities, you likely do. They're just maybe very minimal right now because you haven't really owned them, acknowledged them, looked more into them, and worked to develop them. And that's part of self-responsibility, to not acknowledge or to write off. Maybe you've had times in your life where something did come to you, but over the course of time, ego tells you, nah, you knew it because of this or that or whatever, and explains it away. So be sure to look at yourself and see if you've done that when it comes to any of these abilities, because that's very common too. I have a deep sense that there are many more people with abilities that they're either just not talking about it, or they fit into the category I just described. They kind of know, but they keep writing it off to something else because they don't want to deal with it. They don't want to believe. They don't want to acknowledge that they have special abilities because that would make them different. They don't want to stand out in any way. And for myriad other reasons, they just turn away from them. or maybe acknowledge them slightly, but because it's not something that's necessarily big or glamorous, maybe nothing really sexy or has, glamorous has come to them in a big way. So they just sort of think, that's not an ability. So really take time to consider what I'm sharing today in the context of your own life and your own abilities and your own potential latent abilities. That's part of the self-mastery process in the work of ascension. This is part of you, and looking at that and working with that. So, okay. Another clairsense, one of the more commonly known, is clairvoyance. And that simply means clear vision. And that's the ability to literally tap into another energy system, another mind-body complex, either of the material world, another person, or other beings that are interacting with our reality, non-3D beings, perhaps other entities from other dimensions and densities, and be able to visually perceive with your mind's eye as opposed to the physical eye, one of the 5 sensory perceptions, and be able to, in some cases, clairvoyants see what has been described. They describe as like a movie in the mind's eye. They see an unfoldment of events that may or may not make sense at first. Sometimes there are clairvoyants that are so sensitive that they literally can't, for the time that they're getting the vision, they can't see physically. They lose their sight because the vision supersedes that. Other times what they receive is more symbolic impressions or archetypal impressions that they decipher within themselves. These inherent symbols that we carry that are embedded in our psyche, and they interpret them with regard to the situation or the person perhaps that they're reading, or if just the information just comes to them, they're not doing a reading. So, archetypal imagery type impressions that they decipher as, their understanding, what those symbols and impressions mean to them. And that's different for every clairvoyant. They each have their own kind of set of symbols. Yes, there's some commonality, common archetypes and all, but it's very unique to that individual. These visions, as is the case with many of the abilities I'll be talking about, are accessed typically from an alpha state, a very relaxed, perhaps self-hypnotic or almost meditative state, wherein the individual is very relaxed, very open and receptive, but not in full beta state. They're very alert and aware, but this very pleasant tween state, we'll call it. So, and that's by the true clairvoyance, they're able to quickly get into the state. And you and I do it all the time. If you meditate, or if you're consciously working to move into what they're moving into, it's called the alpha state from a neurological perspective, but it's really the parasympathetic state of the autonomic nervous system. So there are a couple of spin-offs specifically within the clairvoyance category, one of them being precognition, and that's extrasensory knowledge of events that have not yet occurred, and retrocognition, extrasensory knowledge of past events that the individual had no knowledge of, but information comes to them about some past event that didn't involve them at all, but they're aware of it. It comes to them. So these are very, as I said, these are more of some of the more commonly known clairsenses. Clairaudience. That's clear hearing, clear audio. Again, it's the ability to perceive sounds, various tones or voices, maybe unidentifiable noises that are being broadcast from sources that, from other densities, dimensions, or from other entities that are interacting with this, are within our density and dimension. And they're not coming from physical sources. They're not coming from your surroundings. In other words, you hear things that are not sourced in your immediate surroundings. And this audio information can relate specifically to perhaps various timeline events, perhaps past events, or future events. So clairaudience. Now, a number of clairvoyants and other type mediums have access to a number of these different senses that I'm describing. They can tap into, or they just come to them. They open themselves on all of these levels and are able to perceive in multiple different ways when they do get visions and have impressions. They can interpret them from multiple angles. So clairaudience, hearing. Another of these, of the clairsenses, are the clairolfactory or clairscent. It's the same thing. That's clear smelling. And that's the ability to smell either a pleasant or unpleasant smell that's not sourced in any of your immediate environment. It's not materially sourced. You're not smelling it with your nose. You're smelling it psychically. And that might sound strange, but many people have that ability. And an example of that, we've all heard stories where someone was smelling smoke, for example, but there was no source of smoke around. But the individual who was sensing this, and even they knew there was no source, they go and check it. They knew it was beyond their physical environment. And later came to find out that perhaps there was a major fire on the opposite side of the county at that same time that they were experiencing it, sensing it, smelling it psychically. So these occurrences are far more common than most people know, because they're not always reported. The people who have these experiences do not always report them, because society isn't always receptive. People just don't want to talk about the fact that they have these abilities. They're very uncomfortable because even in these modern days, as we well know, people are still ridiculed or mocked or told that they're frauds or whatever. And there are plenty of frauds in this area, unfortunately. That's part of the regressive aspect of our reality and our current evolution cycle. So there is fraud that goes on, but there are legitimate, clair-gifted individuals. And because it's a regressive dominant reality and cycle, many of them just don't acknowledge, as I mentioned at the beginning, for fear of being mocked or ridiculed. They just want to stay in their own little shell, in their own little world, and that's the personal choice that they make. Clairgustance, and that's clear tasting. The same thing I just described with the smell, clairolfactory, clairscent, but with non-physical tasting. You suddenly get Perhaps you're overpowered by a very pleasant taste. Sometimes it's something that you're familiar with, perhaps a special food that you like. Perhaps it's something that you don't like, and you suddenly get a taste in your mouth. Perhaps, maybe it's something like the taste of alcohol, and you no longer drink, or you had not been drinking when you get this sensation. And sometimes it just shows up as a pleasant taste that you can't identify, or a very unpleasant taste that you can't identify. But it's above and beyond anything that you have just had to drink or eat yourself. And as I said, sometimes this doesn't, what you're tasting, you cannot relate to anything that you're familiar with. You don't have a frame of reference. So that's clairgustance. And then another one that's really more commonly known is clairsentience. And that's clear feeling, clear sensing. That's the ability to perceive information by sensation within the mind-body complex. Either a whole body sensation, or sometimes it's limited to certain area or one or two areas of the body. And separate and apart from any external stimuli. Perhaps you feel suddenly, I'll use the fire example again. There's been cases reported where people suddenly felt hot, or as if they were being burned, and nothing was happening around them. But again, they were aware of, at some point in a timeline, or perhaps not, perhaps, some other kind of, but they feel really hot or really cold, and they can't explain why. Then the feeling passes, and sometimes they have an understanding of it, and sometimes they don't. This is why it's so important to do what you can if you're having these type of experiences. And let's say that you come to understand later on that it's like, wow, when you were feeling whatever you were feeling that wasn't externally induced, you find out that there was an event. Or an event occurs in your surroundings at some point in the future. And perhaps this was sort of, connected to a clairvoyant experience, but you also experienced it physically. So that's clairsentience. And then there's a couple of subcategories of clairsentience, one of them being clairtangency. And that's clear touching, and this is more commonly known as psychometry. And that's the ability to perceive information about by touching an object. For example, these glasses. The person who has this ability is able to perceive either historical information about the object itself that wasn't previously known, like where it's been, or somebody who had it before you, or the conditions under which it was made, or somebody else who touched the object. And they can also perceive information about the owner of the object in many cases. This oftentimes it has to do with the palm of the hand. It's stronger there, but many of the clairtangents can sense it even with their fingers, just an immediate touch, or holding someone else's hand. You're touching another individual. Sometimes they're flooded with information that they didn't previously know about the individual. Perhaps they'll get a flash, a physical sensation, maybe something that person experienced in the past, or may be experiencing in the days or weeks or months to come. But a flash of information, it's information through touch. Another subcategory of clairsentience is, and I really like this reference to it, is clairempathy. Now, before I get more into that, a lot of people believe that they're empaths. And first of all, let me make a distinction between sympathy and empathy. Sympathy is the ability to feel for another. Empathy is the ability to feel with another. And I'll break that down a little bit more. To feel for another, that is a deeply compassionate expression of yourself. In other words, whether it's someone you know and deeply care about, or a complete stranger or group of strangers on the other side of the world. Perhaps it's animals that are being abused, or animals that you see and that really make you feel joyous and happy. But the sympathy aspect, animal abuse, that you deeply experience within yourself the other's pain because you care about them, as opposed to empathy, where you're actually experiencing the pain or happiness or excitement, emotional, psychological suffering with another. What they are actually experiencing, you are also experiencing. And this can be really difficult for a child. I know as an empath, growing up, particularly in an environment where no such things are supported or talked about, at least in a supportive way. I'm sure many of you could relate to this, where your abilities, and I'm thrilled for those of you who didn't have to suffer through this, because the tendency can be to begin repressing this ability. And it's very painful to do that. It's very self-destructive to do that. But because it's not supported or understood. How many times have you, many of you, heard, either, not just in childhood, but throughout the course of your life, oh, you're just too sensitive. You need to toughen up. It's you. You're just overreacting. I'm sure many of you can relate to those type of responses. Well, empaths are extremely sensitive. Some can be hypersensitive people. I mean, that's what it's all about. It's the ability to literally sense into, whether intentionally or not, if your empathic abilities, if you haven't gotten a handle on them and been able to set up psychic and energetic boundaries for yourself, it can be very disconcerting, very unsettling, can be very traumatic. When you don't understand that you're picking up on somebody else's energetic system, you're experiencing what they're experiencing within yourself. But if there's no one around to explain that, and you don't understand what's going on, it's very deeply disturbing, can really be harmful to your psyche, to your emotional body, all of that. It can even cause physical illness. So the ability, taking charge, taking ownership of this, if you are indeed an empath, and I'm sure many of you have done this, you've already, you're much more in tune than you were perhaps as a child. But ownership of, you've learned, you've sought out information, sought out assistance in how to manage this ability. And it really is a gift when you understand yourself and how it works, and how you can use it in service to others, in ways that don't drain and diminish you and your energy systems and your journey, don't throw you off track. But it's very important to get a handle on this if you're an empath. And emotions, whether you're an empath or not, learning to manage your emotions, that's one of your creational tools. And being able to process them, let them move through you, experience them, release them in responsible ways without contaminating the consciousness further, the further contamination of our reality and consciousness as a whole, learning how to do that is so important. Many people are in a state of resistance when it comes to the more painful emotions, whether it's anger or deep rage or sadness or even deep depression. We try to put these off because we're so afraid of feeling them, and how we might lose control if we do experience them and let ourselves actually feel them, that many people resist them for that reason, which is, again, very, very harmful to your mental, emotional, and physical health. And then on the other side of that, there are people who tend to not process. They get stuck in the pleasant emotions, happiness, joy, excitement. They keep reliving over and over. They stay stuck in past experiences of extreme happiness or peace or calm, and keeping themselves from living in the now. Pleasant emotions need to be experienced, processed, and let them move through us and be released. It's just as important to do that as it is to release the unpleasant ones, because both create distortions, energetic bottlenecks and blockages that keep us from being able to more fully open to the unconditioned higher awareness and consciousness of soul and core self and divine consciousness. Keeps us from embodying that when we hold on to anything. So emotions are all a part of this too. They relate a lot to these abilities, and being able, like I said, to learning how to set boundaries, to be processing your emotions and learning and getting back to the clear empathy ability. People saying that, people who may have accused you of overreacting, well, you might be really deeply experiencing emotions, physical sensations of others. But that doesn't mean that you're necessarily responding to them in a regressive way. And let me talk about that a minute. Let me explain that further. Whether you're an empath or not, it is not to your advantage to respond through emotion. Even if that emotion is so pleasant and delightful. The ultimate goal of self-mastery is to respond from a non-emotionally, non-psychologically invested state of being. To respond through emotion limits higher order capacities and higher order perspectives of the most progressive possible response to a situation, whether that be an interchange with another, someone you know, a stranger, a situation in your life. To respond through emotions keeps us at a disadvantage. Whatever we're responding to, entity interference, psychic attack, day-to-day life situations, it doesn't matter. If we're responding from an emotionally charged state of being, we're at a disadvantage. And I don't know about you, but that's not where I want to be. This is why I continually strive. And of course, I'm not there yet. It's a process, but being more and more able to come from that place. So to be accused as an empath of overreacting. No, you may be you're extremely sensitive, not just to the sensations of others. And sometimes these people aren't, these, whatever energy system that you've come in contact with, it may not be someone in your immediate surroundings. It could well be an interdimensional entity or being, or some entity that's beyond this reality. That can happen too. But we are extremely sensitive. We experience our own emotions much more intensely than the non-empath. Just our own emotions. We're hypersensitive. So learning to manage that is a key part of this process as well. Learning to come from the objective, non-psychologically, emotionally invested self. Allowing ourselves to feel and experience and acknowledge these without attachment or investment in them. Letting them move through us, letting our emotions and feelings and sensations move through us. We pay attention to them, where we might be experiencing them within, the different areas of the body as they move through us, but without attachment. In other words, from the truly objective perspective rather than the subjective perspective. And I'm not saying that the objective perspective eliminates perhaps very intense pain, but it's a completely different experience. When you're sensing your emotions from the non-subjective, objective perspective, it's a completely different experience. And the emotions move through you much more quickly and efficiently. And it's much easier to transmute them on the spot because you're not hampered by the subjective, distorted perspective and experience of those emotions. So this is a very important process, very important that you understand about emotions, whether or not you're an empath. But as an empath, learning to set psychological, emotional, as well as physical boundaries and psychic boundaries. And that's an art in and of itself. Okay, moving on to another ability. You've heard of channels and channeling. Many of you've probably read the materials of many people who are channeling. And that's the ability to open to the consciousness, the thoughts, expressions of another being. And whether it's verbal, whether they communicate verbally or through impressions, like I discussed earlier, symbolically or whatever, but it's an opening to other entities and allowing them to make these impressions in your own consciousness. Many people do this to the extent wherein their own consciousness is completely overshadowed by the consciousness of the other that they're allowing to come through them. And I've touched on this in other videos, but I'll talk about it a little bit more. I'm sure many of you are, it's very obvious to you already about how dangerous this can be, how many of these channels. I know many have talked about perhaps they were following this particular channel and the information they were getting over the course of maybe many years, and suddenly things start getting really dark. But the whole context of what the individual's talking about changes. But by then, people are really connected to, identified with this person as a guru type. And they're not able to really see the dark turn, to really pick up on it. And many people, the best intentioned people, are being used as channels. They're being told that the entity that they've allowed into their consciousness, they're convinced that this is a so-called benevolent being from another planet, a Pleiadian, an Arcturian, or whatever, the ever-popular Syrian. But, and I don't know how many spiritual teachings, it's common knowledge that the dark forces love to present themselves as the light. And they fool many people. And before too long, there are so many cords between the channeled entity and the person being the channel, that this individual's in over their heads. Sometimes they know it, and sometimes they don't know it. But channeling can be incredibly dangerous. And in a sense, we're all channels, in a sense. And what we're channeling is directly related to our level of awareness, whether or not we're on this journey and we're more aware of higher order objective truths and what's really happening. And we're either channeling ego consciousness, and what ego consciousness, as I said, perhaps in the case of a channel who, the channel is so excited that, wow, something's coming through them, and they know it's not themselves, that there's little, if any, investigation as to who or what this entity really is. They're just so excited at the fact that they can do this that they get easily ensnared by this regressive entity. And that's not to say that there aren't many progressive entities and forces in our reality. There are. One can't exist without the other. But I recommend that you think long and hard before you invite other consciousness into your own. And to be really clear and aware of who and what you're dealing with. So that's basically channeling. And we're either channeling, those of us that aren't, quote, outright channelers, we're either channeling the consciousness of ego or the consciousness of soul, divine consciousness to whatever extent we're capable, or something else. So this is another reason it's so important to get really intimately familiar with your own thoughts, your own typical range and degree of thought and emotion. What's mine? This doesn't seem, or this seems a bit extreme without explanation. Get really in tune with that and learning to observe yourself. Mindfulness, awakened and active meditation, observation, so that you're intimately familiar and can quickly pick up on, from a deep sense of knowing, what's your stuff and what isn't. Discernment. And that can only come through effort. A lot of observation and making note of, and considering and looking at yourself, watching yourself in day-to-day interactions with others and your day-to-day activities. instead of getting in the car and turning, shoving in a CD or turning on the radio. That's a good opportunity. If you're a commuter, you're alert and aware of your environment, paying attention to traffic, but you're watching yourself pay attention to traffic and paying attention to what thoughts are moving through your mind. But observation, paying attention to the state of your body, perhaps not while you're driving, but when you are wherever you're going. Does your body tend to be more in a contracted state or a relaxed state? Many people have so armored their sensory abilities, their 5 sensory abilities, armored themselves from those that they're totally not aware of what they're actually experiencing or what they're thinking or why they're thinking. Why am I thinking this? That they just move through life on autopilot, and they become subject to whatever consciousness is around them, whatever is going on. They're easily influenced, or they're so armored that they're shut down and reclusive and not experiencing life. They're living in such fear that it gets expressed in a different way. So pay attention. Mindfulness of self. Self-observation is how we come to higher self-awareness and higher order awareness of the totality of objective truth. Know thyself. Okay, another ability is remote viewing. That's been really popularized in recent years, and with stories coming out. And I know that a few years back, the movie Men Who Stare at Goats basically covered the topic tongue in cheek and made the whole thing look silly. When in fact, this was a study done by our government, the armed forces, the Army did this, and it still goes on. This isn't over. These types of things don't end. They don't invest the kind of money that they invest to just say, okay, we're done. They know that these abilities are out there. It's the same thing with the UFO, so-called UFO, Project Blue Book. I mean, they didn't stop. The MK Ultra type experiments, none of that stuff stops. They just say, okay, we did this and it was over. And so people go, okay. But this type of work has gone on these type of studies have gone on for years, this type of experimentation, remote viewing. In other words, using people's and developing within individuals psychic abilities to be used as weapons, weaponized psychic abilities. Even if they weren't used to directly cause harm to another, it enabled all sorts of, spurred all sorts of technology to try to mimic that sort of thing. The whole spy culture that we live in. Everything you do, everything's being watched. Everyone is being watched and tracked and all of that. So physical technology, what we see in terms of technology, these so-called advanced technologies, the AI technologies and all that, those are physical copycats of non-physical material, psychic, and so-called other types of extrasensory abilities. They're all mimics of that. Think about that. I'm going to make a video about that, but put that in your pipe and smoke it. Meditate on that. But every physical technology that we see is some expression of a non-man-made technology. Consciousness, energetic abilities and capacities and conditions of our reality being mimicked in hard technology, so to speak. Okay, so remote viewing. That's the ability, just like it sounds, to receive and apperceive mental impressions about people or objects or places at a distance, whether on this planet, across the world, or perhaps in other densities and dimensions. But that's remote viewing. Telekinesis. That's the ability to move material objects without doing so physically, without any, using energetic psychic means solely to move an object. So we've all heard of that. And telepathy. That's the ability to receive information from another or to transmit information to another without using 5 sensory or physical means of interaction. To be able to communicate non-verbally. Without being able to see the individual even. How many times have you been thinking of someone and wishing they would call, and then the phone rings, you pick it up, and they're there? It happens to them too. Someone may be thinking of you, and you suddenly get this urge to call somebody or to reach out in some other way to that individual. There's likely telepathic communication going on. So many of these gifts and abilities, we just do things and things happen. We don't really think about it. But I'm sure many of you who think you don't have abilities probably have multiple abilities. And it shouldn't be about wanting them or going through this process. Some people are going through this work just to enhance or tap into perhaps what are latent or maybe weaker special abilities, just so they can have that. And these are to be viewed as byproducts of this process, not as the carrot for moving through this work. And yes, it can be exciting, the thought of these, some of these gifts coming, but it's also a big responsibility. These gifts are neither meant to be exploited or discounted. It's about discovering what you have, developing it, respecting it, using it in ways that are in accordance with the rules of engagement for this reality, the code of conduct, for example, to use your abilities. And this comes into play a lot of times. This is played out, I should say, in many New Age communities. It's no different to impose a psychic ability on someone who didn't ask for it or didn't say it was okay for you to do something without their fully informed, aware consent is no different than those in the New Age community who are out there, spreading love and light, sending it to people, whether or not they ask for it. First of all, that's in breach of the rules of engagement. To impose your creations, your gifts, your abilities, your energies on another without permission is regressive creation, because you're in breach of the code of conduct. It's no different, like I said, than those who are spreading the love, sending their love and light to others who did not ask for it. And not only is it, first and foremost, it's in breach. So it's regressive creation. It's no different than the ruling class who impose their beliefs, through movies and social engineering and through the education, the indoctrination system, imposing upon us without our express consent or understanding of what's being imposed upon us. So you would be no different than those people who are in breach of the regressive forces, who are in breach of the code of conduct. So it's up to you to be really responsible and to use these abilities very prudently, connect deeply with core self, as to aligning with that will as to how your ability is to be used. And these are gifts. And progressive consciousness in creation is a service to others process. But that doesn't always mean that you impose it, that you give your gifts to everyone you encounter that you think might need this or could benefit from it. It can be very harmful too. It can really backfire in ways that you can't even perceive. If you're sending out this kind of energy, imposing it upon a particularly regressive consciousness, first of all, it's against the will of that other person. You're taking their free will away. You're interfering with their journey. And you would say, well, you know, this person that I really know and love and care about is so deeply immersed in regressive psychological pathologies, emotional pathologies, or physical illness, and you know that they're not capable of making this decision for themselves, so I'm just going to make it for them. That's risky business, because even at that, you're still in breach of the code of conduct. Now, only you can make these determinations, but just know that there could be some regressive ramifications, not only for yourself, but for the other person that you can't perceive. We are not aware of. We're not capable of being aware of in this density and dimension. No matter how advanced we're becoming, you know, how much we're raising our levels of awareness and consciousness, we cannot understand all the different forces and energies at work. In addition to our own energies, we are not the sole creators of our reality, period. We are co-creators. And yes, what we put out there does contribute greatly, particularly in our own reality bubble. But there are other forces and energies at play, not just our own. So really, really be responsible with your use and application of these gifts, and finding ways that you can apply them that are of service to others, but in ways that are aligned with and expressed as progressive creation. In other words, they're in alignment with the principles of creation for our reality and the conditions, the governing conditions, you know, the understanding, the balancing process, the principle of rhythm, the pendulum swings, the principle of correspondence, as above, so below, and the rules of engagement. All of those things taken into consideration, and as they are aligned with soul's desire, soul's purpose. So deep, deep contemplation and consideration as to how your gifts and when your gifts should be used in service to others. And the final ability that I'm going to talk about is healing, energetic healing. And this is a gift that I came into this world with without knowing it. I was told all throughout my childhood. I mean, people that came in physical contact with me, a number of them, you know, family members told me that people that did not believe in any of this kind of stuff would, but I've always been told that I had a healing touch, or that I really was, you know, sensitive to when I would help someone, just maybe perhaps comfort someone or hug someone, or I know in the latter years when my mother was so ill, she was really aware of, would tell me that, and she was totally not someone who who believed in this type of thing. Oh, she might have toyed with it a little bit, but totally not. And certainly not through me. But as a child, I had various family members that were, I had an uncle and one of my grandmothers was always asking me to give them, a neck rub or a shoulder rub, that kind of thing. Again, it wasn't spoken, but I mean, I felt like at times I got to where I really didn't even want to visit certain relatives because it's like I always had to do the massage thing, the neck or the back or whatever. So, but after I had an intense awakening experience, a couple decades ago, and again, after that experience, I became more aware of this ability. The ability, and I started experimenting with it consciously in myself. I literally had an experience. I literally stumbled into this experience when I tripped and stubbed my toe one day. And I was just in a flow and running late or something, and I just said no. And I knew what I meant. No, don't have time for the pain. Don't. And I figured out later that I literally intercepted the signals, the neurological signals that were being sent, the neurotransmission from toe to brain and back. And I didn't feel any pain. And in fact, I found out later that I broke my toe. It was broken, but I didn't feel any pain. And so from there, I began experimenting and doing, and have been able to eliminate a number of diseases. And I've always been a healthy person, but things that I've been through in my life that I wouldn't have been able to get through with sanity left, some really extremely painful physical experiences, working through, I was able to eliminate asthma, physical pain on many different occasions. Too, I eliminated IBS, just a variety of things. And you can read more about that on the About page of my website, and I'll put a link to that. But that and many other disorders, energetically. And I work with people in that too. Take people, showing them how they can do this for themselves. But anyway, my experience, as I mentioned a minute ago, during the latter years of her life, my mother was she had so many physical ailments going on. And I took care of her for a time and lived with her, taking care of her. And on a couple of occasions, she would just be so miserable at nighttime. I did this twice at night. When she had, on top of her regular ailments, some sort of stomach ailments, which she had a lot because she was on so many medications that messed with her that way. But, she was really vulnerable to like flus and all. She usually recovered pretty quickly, but on a couple of occasions, she was just literally moaning out loud. It was just, as an empath, it's very difficult. It's very difficult to separate yourself, especially when you consider the narcissist, the codependent relationship that we had. And I'm going to do videos about narcissism and empathy, the relationship with empath and all that coming up. But so I took a chance. I knew she would never agree to me saying, let me see what I can do energetically, physical contact. But I took it upon myself on 2 different occasions, minor issues, and from another room in the house, was able to eliminate this superficial disorder. Did that 2 times. And that's when I said, okay, I'm interfering. This is not appropriate. This is not responsible. But I became aware that I could do it. And so it was at that point that I decided that I need to be able to study myself, pay attention to how I'm able to do this for myself, and be able to explain that to others so that they can tap into it themselves and use it with and on themselves, or with others' permission, do it for others, but always with permission, aware, conscious consent. But like I said, in my journey, what I've chosen to do is to teach others how to tap into this for themselves. And that's just a decision that I made. And what I will add to that is one of the main reasons I chose to do that is because we live in such a culture of done for you that people expect, they want to go to someone, take a pill, they want to have someone, okay, remove an entity, okay, I want that, but without taking full self-responsibility and fully healing that. Because someone doing, quote, doing these kinds of things for you, whether they're entity removal or, like I said, physical healing, without learning and healing in yourself the root level contributors to these situations, whether it be a physical ailment or entity interference, or you're struggling with finances or whatever the heck it is, if you don't heal holistically, healing on every level, the physical, the metaphysical level, interdimensional understandings, the soul level, the whole of consciousness, all these different perspectives and angles, psychological, emotional levels, then nothing has changed. You might experience relief for a time, but sometimes these things can come back at you with such a vengeance. It's like, after a surgery. If that wound, once the offending mechanism, tumor, whatever's being removed, is removed, if you don't take proper care of the wound, healing the wound, after the extraction or after the procedure, then you could end up dying from the infection itself. So we wouldn't do that. So why, when it comes to healing ourselves, to the self-mastery process, self-ascension work, would we view it any differently? Whether we're going to someone for a soul retrieval or whatever. This is why I teach these things. Teach people how to do these things for themselves. That's self-mastery. That's ownership. That is self-responsibility. And it is very humbling and awesome when you start developing these things in yourself and using them, learning from the get-go how to be responsible in their use. That's self-mastery. That's what opens us to and restores these dormant, the aspects of our genetic template, our original template that have been lying in dormancy. We reactivate the original human genetics when we restore the mind-body complex, take responsibility for all of its capacities, learning to develop them and use them responsibly, and applying these in every area of our lives. This is how we restore and activate. So, in any case, I hope you'll take time to start really looking into these abilities in yourself, experimenting with them with yourself. If you need assistance, I'm here. If this information was helpful, please share it with others. Um, if you haven't already subscribed, I hope you'll do so either on YouTube or on my site. And in the meantime, till we meet again, I wish you all the best on your journey and look forward to seeing you next time. Till then, take care.